Hi all, this is a video on the chapters 18, 19, 20 in module 3. So in these chapters, we're going to talk about supply, demand, and bringing both of those together in a market. So chapter 18, first we're going to look at, in chapter 18, first we're going to look at demand, we're going to look at buyers. Chapter 19 looks at supply, meaning sellers, and bringing both together in a market puts both buyers and sellers on the same graph in the same XY axis. Okay. So starting with some vocab in this module, demand is going to be the predictable pattern of buying behaviors over a given time. So this is going to be these predictable patterns that buyers are able and willing at these prices to buy a given amount over time. A demand schedule looks at an entire table, a tabulation of the quantity demanded of a good that includes all consumers in a market at a given price. So an entire market demand schedule will look at the entire market, so all consumers. We can also look at individual demand schedules, meaning we can look at just a single person or single firm's demand for a good. So like I said, this is going to be at every price, at every given price, how much is going to be demanded? What is the quantity demanded? So with quantity demanded being said, this is going to be the total amount of a good or service consumers demand over a given time interval in that demand schedule. So like, all of these words are very interrelated, meaning like that demand schedule is going to show our entire demand function, and that quantity demanded is going to be a column within that demand schedule. Okay, so a complement good in this module, we talk about a good or service that adds value to a second good or service. So in this case, a complement good would be hot dogs and hot dog buns. It would be hamburgers and ketchup. It would be a second shoe, one shoe and having the second shoe. So these are goods or services that complement or go along with another to boost the value for both. Right? So a substitute good is just the opposite of that. Instead of boosting the value of the second good or service, a substitute good is actually going to be goods or services that are used for the exact same purpose. So the consumer perceives these goods as interchangeable, comparable. So this could be the difference between Kroger brand and name brand, or this could be the difference between almond milk and cow's milk. So goods or services that are possibly interchangeable or possibly could compete with one another will be these substitute goods. A normal good is where now, instead of talking about the good and service in relation to one another, a normal good is going to look at the relationship between demand and income. So when our demand when we have some kind of change in income, so if we have an increase in income, a normal good, we should see that demand increase with an increase in income. Okay, so if we found $20, a normal good is something we would purchase more of if we saw a change in income. Whereas this inferior good is going to be the opposite. As we have an increase in income in this case, for an inferior good, we would actually see a decrease in that demand for a good or service. So my favorite example of an inferior good is ramen noodles, like the cup of noodles. So when I was in undergrad, that is a cheap, easy, quick meal that I can make. And as my income has changed over the years, now I may not demand ramen noodles as much. So my demand for that has decreased as I saw an increase in income. So that is an example of an inferior good. So we're going to talk now about the factors that can shift the demand curve. But before even going on to this, I want to share, let's just look at a demand curve. So if I were to want to draw a demand curve, there are a few rules I know about demand. I know that as my price increases for a good, the demand for my good is going to decrease. So the more expensive a good is, the less that is demanded of it. So that is my first rule for my demand curve. This is called the law of demand. Knowing this downward sloping relationship. As price increases, quantity demanded is going to decrease. Secondly, we see that as price goes up, if actually, scratch that, sorry. So here we're looking at a demand curve, like I said. So this could be an individual's demand curve, a single firm's demand curve. It could be the total market demand curve. So let's go back to factors now that can shift this demand curve. So now we're going to talk factors that are going to not shift single points, but we're going to shift actually our entire demand curve. So these factors we're going to talk about are factors that can make our demand curve go left or right, up or down. It can increase demand, it can decrease demand. So this is what these shifts that we're about to talk about will look like. All right. All right. So talking about the factors that can shift the demand curve in that way, like we said, to the left and down, to the right and up. The first factor that can do this is taste or preference of consumers. So obviously if something goes out of style, as something becomes more popular, as something, whatever, for the time and the place and those circumstances, taste and preferences will change for consumers. So that changes the demand for which consumers will want to buy that product. So taste and preferences will shift that demand curve. So when we're also looking at the demand curve, we know we're looking at a specific time interval, some given period of time. So when we're looking at maybe, if we want to look at a market from 2000s for flip phones, I know that my tastes have changed. So my demand curve might have been right here in 2000. But now, like I said, so let's say this is the demand for flip phones. My demand in 2000 for flip phones was a lot different than the demand it is that we have now for flip phones. Now we have much more advanced technologies, so the demand for flip phones is not as high. So this is something that would shift our curve left. So we would see a leftward shift. So now in this case, we have, this is the demand from, say this is demand of 2020, and this is the demand from 2000. So as I said, taste and preference will change and can shift demand dependent on the time, on preferences at that moment. So the second factor that we're going to talk about that can shift demand for a good is own price. So when we talk about own price, we mean the price that a good or service is being sold at and how that influences the amount being sold and the amount of people buying at that price. So for example, own price could mean how much, say I'm in the market for a slice of pizza. Own price is going to determine my demand for pizza. So say one single slice of pizza is $10. My demand for this product or for this pizza is a lot lower. So I might only demand one slice of pizza rather than if the price of each slice of pizza was $2. In that case, my demand might be a little bit higher. I might be willing to purchase two at that price. So that's how own price influences the demand for a good. Third, related goods and services. that kind of speaks for itself. For income, so as income changes, as we see income change, whether that's some kind of change in wage, whether that's an example of government relief, such as like the stimulus package, that's a change in income, things like that. When we see income change, we're going to see demand for goods change as well with that. And then expectations. Expectations are going to shift our demand curve because once again, if I expect a good or service to be maybe this price, if I expect a good or service to have this sort of preference, whatever it may be, if I expect related goods and services to be priced at a given price, if my expectations aren't met when going to purchase this good or service, I might not be willing to pay that given amount if my expectations aren't met. So, like I said, if I'm going to buy a piece of pizza and I have $5 in my pocket, I get there and one slice of pizza itself is $5. I wouldn't have expected that. I was thinking $2 a slice. And so my demand for this pizza might shift down because of that change in expectation. I just wasn't expecting that increase in price. So same goes for the expectations of 2, 3, and 4. Well, I guess 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if I have expectations set of those factors that I talked about in 1 through 4, and those expectations change, that has the power to influence and shift my demand curve. Okay, so talking about the sort of notation when talking about market demand, quantity demand, this looks really complicated. I promise you it is not. We're going to go through and explain what each part of this equation means. So let's start right here. Quantity demand is a function of all of our previous factors that we just discussed. So if we go back to our last slide, we talked about these factors 1 through 5, taste, price, related goods, income, expectations. So I can see that my quantity demand, like I said, is a function. So that is what this F is. There's some relationship between all these factors and my quantity being demanded. So what this says from left to right, this says quantity demanded equals some function. So I don't have to explicitly say, here's the relationship between quantity demanded and these factors. I don't have to know every relationship to know that there is some relationship that exists between these factors and the quantity demanded. So let's start over. Sorry, quantity demanded equals some function of price of complement goods, I believe, price of substitute goods, income, taste, and then once again, those expectations of all of the factors, and then other factors that may not have been mentioned. So QD, this is how we're going to denote quantity demanded from here on out. You'll see it written this way a lot. So we write it out this way because this is a much quicker shorthand way to say, hey, all of these factors may shift this demand curve. So just succinctly in one equation, we can show that there exists a relationship between the quantity demanded of some good and all these factors. We could explicitly write out the exact function. In this case, I did not. I just left it some ambiguous function F. And once again, we write it out this way. It's a lot easier to write and express all the factors that can shift that demand. All right, so talking about the difference between a demand shift and a quantity demanded shift. So let's draw 2 graphs. As we just talked about before, we saw demand shifts. We saw demand shifts that went to the left and down, to the right and up. So let's do a demand shift this way, down and to the left. So I see a decrease in demand here. So once again, some kind of change in preferences has altered my demand for a good, it has decreased that demand in good. So my whole demand function has shifted to the left. So in the case now of, I want to talk about the change in the change in quantity demanded rather than a change in absolute demand. So now we're looking at some demand curve. And instead of shifting, once again, like I said, instead of shifting this entire demand curve, we're just going to look at the change from one point on this curve to another. So we'll start here, and then we'll go down to here. So this is quantity demanded 1. And this is quantity demanded 2. So the difference between graph 1 and graph 2 in this case, as I said, we're going to see just a shift in these dots right here, rather than a shift in the whole curve. So something that could shift the quantity demanded. So if we are to draw a line down from, okay, so sorry, with these graphs redrawn, this first graph, like I said, is showing that downward shift in demand, whereas this right-hand graph, we're showing a downward decrease in quantity demanded. So on this right-hand graph over here, if we go all the way down, we see that on our x-axis where we have quantity, the quantity demanded at each point, we see quantity 1 here decrease to quantity 2. So we see a downward shift in quantity demanded in this right-hand graph. So knowing the difference between these two is going to make a huge difference when we start working on examples and problems. So make sure you're being really careful to the difference between a shift in demand and a shift in quantity demanded. Okay. All right. So chapter 18, talking about total market demand now, when we're talking about these buyers and these individual demand curves, we're talking about single firms, single households, single individual demand curves. So when we want to measure the total market demand, we are going to bring all the people who demand a certain good or service into one market and add together their demand functions. So as an individual demand curve represents a single demand for a good at a given period of time, our total market demand curve is now going to represent all consumers of a market and their willingness to buy over some given period of time. So let's give an example of 2 consumers in a given market. Okay. So. Okay, now that we have both curves drawn, I'm going to do an example for 2 consumers in a given market. So to find the total market demand when we have 2 consumers, so our goal is to find this total market demand, we add together both individuals' demands, their demand functions. So here I've drawn out 2 demand schedules. So I see at price equals to 3, I am selling 0. At price equals to 2 for the demand, or for the second consumer, I am once again purchasing 0 as well. So that's going to be the highest amount that they would possibly pay before not purchasing any of this good. So at $3, we have 0 willingness to buy. So for our total demand, we're adding together the individual 1, individual 2, and in this case, it's 0. So at price equals to 2, so on this left-hand side, we're looking at our price equals to $2 right here. At price equals to $2, I still have 0 demand for my second individual, but my first individual now demands 1 of quantity of whatever good this is. So at price equals to 2, we can do quantity, we go down here to our x-axis, quantity equals 1, when our price equals 2 right here. Okay, so same thing with 1. I'm going to add together 2, and I'm going to add together 1, so I get 1, 3. And so from there, I can draw my total market demand, okay? And we can see that, we can see from that how we can get that total market by adding together every single individual within a market. It doesn't have to just be 2 consumers. It could be a number of households. It could be a handful of firms. It could be amount of government bodies, whoever is demanding this good or service. We're going to count all consumers and add up their individual demands. All right. Okay, so moving on to chapter 19, sellers. Instead of talking about the demand curve now, so demand curve, we talked about buyers, people who demanded a good or service. Now in chapter 19, we're talking about the supply curve, the people who supply a good or service, the sellers of these goods. So just as we said, these buyers could be individuals, households, firms, or government, same thing goes for sellers. Sellers could be any type of body or entity. So to start, let's take prices as a given right now for sellers, meaning that buyers nor sellers get to choose the price at which our good is going for on the market, okay? We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but this means that when we have price as a given, this means that this market is competitive, meaning that there are numerous producers competing with each other. So buyers and sellers are called these price takers in this competitive market. So like I said, these prices are going to be a given in our demand, in our markets. We want to show the quantity demanded at an array of prices, but buyers and sellers are going to take these prices as a given. They are not choosing these prices. We're just going to show all the different quantities that would either be supplied or demanded at every given price in that demand and supply schedule. So sellers cannot decide what price to sell their products at, but what they can decide to do is choose what quantity to produce at. So buyers and sellers, once again, get to choose, one, at what quantity are we going to, at how much of this good am I going to buy at this price? Whereas sellers can decide, how much of this good am I willing to supply at this price that it's being sold at, okay? So in order to determine at what quantity we're going to supply at, sellers want to, their main goal is profit. So we say in economics that most people are rational agents if they do what's best for themselves. So in this case, companies, their best interest is to optimize, to maximize these profits. So that's kind of where these calculations are going to come from. That idea that people are trying to maximize their amount of utility, whatever it may be, with their given inputs, with whatever given inputs that they have, whether that's a given income, given situation, circumstance, whatever it is, cost of inputs. So profits just equal revenue minus total cost of production, where revenue equals the price of the good times the quantity of that good sold. Total cost of production is going to be determined by cost of inputs, such as rents, wages, interest rates, government regulation, and any type of other expenditure during the production process. Okay, so 2 different concepts, economic cost and accounting cost. So accounting costs are going to account for when we want profit. In accounting costs, we're counting that monetary value, that number that we sold and the number that we spent on this good or service. Whereas economic cost will now take into account the opportunity cost of this production of this good or service, okay? So accounting costs are just that monetary cost, that monetary value, whereas economic cost is always going to include those opportunity costs of production within those calculations. So just as we had factors that affected our willingness for demand, we also have factors that affect our willingness to sell. So for an individual supply curve, once again, we could say individual supply equals some function, just meaning that there's a relationship between the supply and price and the cost of inputs, cost of production. So anything that is going to impact the price of inputs is going to impact the supply of this good. And then the main factor, once again, is going to be that own price, is going to be a huge factor in determining what's going to be sold. So, like I said, own price, consider the biggest factor. So think about it. Whatever price you are able to sell your good or product at is going to most affect your decision to produce. So, meaning if I'm a pizza maker and I'm being offered $200 per pizza to make pizzas, I'm probably going to supply a lot more freaking pizza, you know? So when I think about it vice versa now, if I'm being offered $2 to supply per pizza or to supply a single pizza, I might not be willing to supply as many pizzas. I might be only willing to supply 50 pizzas versus the 100 pizzas I would be willing to supply at a higher price. If I were making more revenue, more profit from each pizza, that's going to affect my decision to supply at this amount, this quantity, the most. All right, so other factors that affect willingness to sell, population change, that's going to change the number of sellers, buyers in the market, new technologies, changes in government policy and wages, things that are, so especially new technologies, things that make the price of inputs more efficient. It makes that capital go further, and changes in government policy and wages, such as raising the minimum wage, that might increase prices, increase inputs of production, meaning that would affect our willingness to sell and supply. Okay, so once again, talking from that individual supply curve to that total market supply, we're going to do the same thing as we did with the demand. Sorry, disregard this demand up here. It's total market supply. So when we're looking at individual supply curves, we're seeing the relationship when all factors are held constant. We're looking at price and quantity demanded for one singular seller. So to find that total market supply, we're going to add up all the possible consumers, all their individual supply functions. And then that total market supply is going to show us the relationship between price and the amount sellers are willing to sell or supply at each price. So therefore, the total market supply is the sum of all of those individual supply functions. So once again, we could show the 2, 3, 4 consumers in a market and show how their little graphs, each little graph adds up to the overall, the bigger total market supply function. Okay. So meaning anything that's going to affect, that we just talked about, these factors that affect willingness to sell, anything that's going to shift an individual's willingness to sell is also going to shift the total market supply curve too. So reviewing chapters 18 and 19, we looked at law of supply and law of demand. So that law of supply is going to tell us we were looking at our supply curves, and all supply curves are going up because, as I said, as this price increases, as our price on this left-hand side is going up, I want to provide or sell more and more quantity. My quantity is going to increase as my price increases because I can make more per good. So in this case, our supply curve is upward sloping. So this is our entire law of supply right here. The reason this is upward sloping is law of supply. So we can say the same thing for law of demand. We have a downward sloping law of demand always, because as price goes up, our willingness to buy goes down as consumers. So we're going to draw that price on the left-hand side, quantity on our x-axis. So as a demand curve, we know it's going to be downward sloping, because as our price increases, the quantity we demand decreases. So think about that single slice of pizza. If a piece of pizza is $10, we do not want to buy as many as if the price were down at $2. Our quantity would be a lot higher. We come down, we go across, we find that point on that demand curve, and then we bring it down to see how much quantity is actually demanded from these prices. So we see that a really high price is going to lead to less of a quantity demanded. And here, average price is going to lead to more quantity demanded. All right, so these are the basics of law of supply and law of demand, and how our curves are always going to be upward sloping and downward sloping. Okay, so now bringing together those chapters 18, 19 from law of supply, law of demand. Now let's talk about bringing them together into a singular market. So bringing together supply and demand curves. Okay, so let's start with let us start with drawing out our axes. Once again, we're always going to have price on that left-hand side and quantity on our bottom x-axis. So price is always our independent variable. It's always going to be that y variable. So I have some supply curve here and some demand curve that looks like this. Okay. So in this case, when I draw my supply and demand curves like this, I want to find the equilibrium. I know that in any free market, in any market that has no forces pushed upon it, we find equilibrium by finding where that demand curve is going to cross that supply curve. So where the willingness to pay for a good equals the same willingness to pay at a given quantity. So let's take a look at this graph. We see right here, this is where our supply and demand intersect. So I go to this point right down here and I go down. I follow it all the way down to quantity demanded. So the intersection of that supply and demand will give me my quantity demanded. So when I go from that point, once again, that point of intersection to my price on my left-hand axis, this is going to give me my price of a good. So at this given price, this is how many goods are going to be sold. And at this particular point, when we are at equilibrium, we are at the most efficient trade possible. If we were to trade more, we would be in disequilibrium. If we were to trade less, we would still have higher demand. We'll talk a little bit more about those kind of disequilibriums. But in this case, I just want to point out how important it is that at this point of intersection, we have just the most efficiency possible from trade. This is the price and the quantity at which the most suppliers and the most consumers will be happy. Okay, so I just want to also point out in this efficiency of equilibrium, at this point of intersection, when we find that left-hand side price, we're going to call this equilibrium price, and it's going to be denoted P star, just like this. Same thing with our quantity demanded. When we go down to the quantity on our x-axis, we're going to find this equilibrium quantity and denote that Q star. So these are our equilibrium prices and quantities. So where could we lose gains from trade if we don't end up at this equilibrium? Well, I'm going to show you. I'm going to draw it red. Okay, so if for some reason we were up here at this higher price, we would have a demand that wanted a quantity down here, and we would have a supply that would supply out here. So we see in this case, suppliers and buyers are not on the same page. We are not wanting the same quantity demanded. We're not equaling. We don't have that same quantity equal. When we have a lower price, when we have a price down here, we have a supply that is too short. It falls very low on our quantity demanded, and we have a demand that's very high. So if we think this one through, where we have a super low price, suppliers aren't willing to supply too much, but demanders at this really low price, a lot of people are willing to pay this amount for a good. So our demand, our quantity demanded is going to be a lot higher when our price is a lot lower. So this is where that disequilibrium occurs, okay? So where we have these disequilibriums is where we're going to lose those possible gains from trade. So dependent on where that equilibrium is and at what point we're at then, like afterwards, we can find who's winning, who's losing, dependent on the quantity demanded. So if we're only being supplied 50 of a good, but 100 at this price, 100 quantity is demanded, we have 50 consumers that are unable to purchase this good because there's a shortage. Suppliers are only supplying up to 50 of these, whatever, this good or service. An additional 50 consumers are going to be unhappy because there's a shortage in this market. So we'll talk about those losses a little bit more in the next two chapters, as long as you know that equilibrium is the most efficient point of trade within that graph. All right. And so lastly, I just want to point out that if we do have disequilibriums in the market, our natural market forces are always going to kind of push buyers and sellers back towards that equilibrium. So if I were to draw it out, it would look a little something like this. I would have my supply and demand. Sorry, this is going to be very sloppy, but if we had a supply and demand that were up here, what is going to happen is each of these on this demand curve, our demand is going to get pushed down. And in this case, our supply curve is a little bit too high. Our supply is also going to get pushed back down to this equilibrium right here. Like I said, this is the most efficient point of trade on the graph right here on our supply and demand market. In this case, all these market forces are going to push our equilibrium back into place. If we had points down here where our price was really low, so if we had a point here and here, these market forces would push them back up this way. It would force the price up and it would force demand to go down a little bit in this case, okay? So we'll talk about those disequilibriums a little more, but talking about the efficiency of this market being at equilibrium is going to be that most efficient point for both buyers and sellers. All right, that kind of wraps up the overview of supply, demand, and bringing them together in a market. There will be one more review video on chapters 21, 22, and 23, and exercises for this supply and demand schedules and working through that. All right, let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.